Across defense ministries stretching from Warsaw to Berlin, a quiet question is circulating with growing urgency. Is Russia moving toward a direct strike on European territory? Few officials are willing to address it openly because any honest assessment leads in multiple uncomfortable directions. Most analysis tends to concentrate on visible indicators like troop deployments, missile reach, and satellite reconnaissance. That approach treats conflict as a simple matter of hardware and numbers. Yet major power escalation rarely follows that logic alone. Wars are not initiated purely by military strength. They emerge from incentives, from leadership calculations about acceptable risk, and from the difference between perceived threats and the ability to respond to them. The real question is not only whether capability exists, but when decision makers believe action can be taken without unbearable consequences. To understand Russia's potential choices, one has to ask what would make a strike seem reasonable from Moscow's point of view, and what would make it seem too costly. History suggests that perception of power shifts often matters more than isolated events. Many commentators reach for 1938 and the Munich Agreement when trying to interpret the present. But a more revealing comparison is found in ancient conflict between Sparta and Athens before the Peloponnesian War. The historian Thucydides identified three driving forces behind war: fear, honor, and interest. As Athens expanded its influence, Sparta did not react only to specific provocations. The broader shift in balance created a sense that inaction would be more dangerous than confrontation. The anticipation of future weakness became a catalyst for conflict. That framework is often used to interpret modern Russian calculations toward Europe, not as a question of ideology or personality, but as an assessment of shifting power trajectories and narrowing options over time. From this perspective, if Moscow judges that European unity is weakening, that public support across Europe is becoming more fragile, and that United States attention is increasingly focused on the Indo-Pacific region, then limited actions at NATO's eastern perimeter may appear more strategically useful than large-scale conventional war. The more plausible risk is not a deep armored advance into Poland. That kind of scenario belongs more to Cold War imagination than to current logistical reality, where sustained offensives have been limited in scope and distance. Instead, concern centers on smaller, controlled incidents designed to remain unclear in origin. Actions that create uncertainty rather than trigger immediate unified response. Recent events often discussed in this context include the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, unexplained drone activity near military installations in Germany and Denmark, and damage to underwater communication cables in the Baltic region linked to ships with unclear ownership structures. The key feature in all of these cases is ambiguity. A clearly attributable attack would force a direct reaction. But uncertainty creates disagreement, especially inside a large alliance composed of 32 member states, with differing political pressures, economic interests, and threat perceptions. That internal debate is itself strategically significant. It can slow collective response and complicate consensus at the exact moment unity is most important. Historical precedent is sometimes drawn from the early Cold War. The Soviet Union did not attempt to seize West Berlin by force. Instead, it tested whether Western commitment would hold under pressure. When confronted with a Berlin airlift rather than retreat, Stalin gained a clearer understanding of Western resolve. That episode demonstrated the limits of coercion against a unified response. In the present context, the interpretation is that Russia may be conducting a similar form of testing behavior, not aimed at territorial conquest of NATO states, but at evaluating the practical boundaries of alliance cohesion under stress, in a period where that cohesion appears less predictable than in the late 1940s. The United States learned this under pressure when it attempted to restock Ukraine's ammunition requirements and discovered that its own production capacity, weakened after decades of limited investment following the Cold War, was unable to match the pace of consumption in a modern artillery conflict. If the largest defense industrial base in the world struggled to keep up, it raises a broader question about the preparedness of European states that, for roughly 30 years, treated defense budgets as a peace dividend and redirected resources toward domestic social priorities. That imbalance did not emerge from a single decision. It developed gradually through repeated small pressures, weakening financial stability, labor shortages, and an ongoing buildup of political inefficiency that made fast collective responses to external threats more difficult. The question becomes whether this pattern feels familiar. Europe today is dealing with a similar structural issue. The weakness is not concentrated in any one NATO member. Instead, it lies in the alliance's reduced ability to make fast, unified decisions, shaped by enlargement, differing national priorities, and economic ties with the very actors the alliance is meant to deter. After the year 2022, that entire framework was disrupted. What followed was not a smooth shift toward energy independence, but a costly and improvised effort to secure liquefied natural gas from the United States and Gulf producers, arriving at price levels that have permanently reduced Germany's industrial competitiveness compared with both the United States and China. From Moscow's perspective, the logic of incentives changes in this environment. If natural gas exports can no longer function as a direct pressure tool, then strategy shifts toward other forms of influence. These tend to be ambiguous, deniable actions that remain below open conflict thresholds. When a primary peacetime instrument of leverage disappears, a state must either accept reduced influence or develop new mechanisms of pressure that operate outside traditional warfare boundaries. This ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects the use of legal and political gaps. The North Atlantic Treaty, established in 1949, was designed for a world defined by armored divisions and strategic bombers, not by anonymous digital networks or unmarked aerial systems. The key question is whether NATO's Article 5 commitment, created in an earlier technological and strategic era, still functions as a reliable deterrent against modern forms of pressure that its original framework did not anticipate. Historical comparisons are often drawn to Japan before the Second World War. In that case, decisions were shaped by severe resource constraints. An oil embargo limited Japan's ability to sustain military operations across Asia. Faced with that pressure, leadership concluded that a sudden and decisive strike might create enough strategic space to negotiate from a stronger position before United States industrial capacity could fully mobilize. In hindsight, that calculation proved deeply flawed when measured against long-term industrial strength. But at the moment of decision, it appeared rational to those involved because it was formed under conditions of constraint rather than stability. An oil embargo that severely restricted Japan's ability to continue its military operations across Asia was paired with a belief that a sudden and decisive strike could provide enough strategic time and space to negotiate from a stronger position before the full industrial capacity of the United States could be brought to bear. In hindsight, that decision stands as a profound misjudgment of long-term industrial balance. Yet, at the moment it was made, it appeared rational to those involved because it was formed under pressure and limitation rather than stability and comfort. Within that same logic, a limited action inside NATO territory, carefully designed to stay below the threshold that would activate full Article 5 mobilization, would be expected to serve several objectives at once. It would restore Russia's visibility and strategic relevance on the global stage. It would probe the internal cohesion of the alliance at relatively low cost. It could also create tension between United States strategic priorities, which are increasingly oriented toward China, and European security concerns that remain centered on Russia. At the same time, it would pressure European societies, many of which have already experienced fatigue from the economic burden of supporting Ukraine, to confront the real extent of their willingness to uphold collective defense commitments that have largely remained theoretical in practice. A limited action inside NATO territory, carefully engineered to remain below the threshold of full Article 5 activation, is framed as producing multiple simultaneous effects. It reinforces Russia's role as a relevant global actor. It tests alliance unity without requiring large-scale escalation. It may also widen the gap between United States strategic focus shifting toward China and European strategic focus remaining on Russia. It places pressure on European publics, many of whom have grown weary of the financial and economic costs linked to supporting Ukraine, forcing them to reconsider how much sacrifice they are prepared to accept for collective security guarantees that have not yet been fully tested in reality. This leads into a broader demographic and civilizational issue that is rarely addressed openly because it does not align cleanly with either pro-Western or pro-Russian perspectives. Europe is simultaneously shrinking and aging in population, a combination without historical precedent for a major power in peacetime conditions. Russia's demographic trend is also negative, further strained by wartime losses and the emigration of educated and mobile citizens. China, often viewed as a supporting partner to Russia through discounted energy imports and transfers of dual-use technology, is facing an even faster demographic decline than either Europe or Russia. What emerges is not a clear divide between a rising power and a declining one, as was often assumed during the Cold War framework. Instead, it is a system of multiple declining powers, each attempting to secure strategic advantage before internal limitations become fully binding. This creates a more unstable environment than one defined by confident expansion, because declining powers tend to act with greater urgency and reduced patience. The central question then becomes where this leads. It is not simply whether Russia will carry out a clear and direct strike inside Europe. The more important issue is whether a series of ambiguous actions below the threshold of open war, already occurring over time, will eventually escalate to a point where a unified alliance response becomes unavoidable, and whether that response will be coherent and collective, or whether it will instead reveal the very divisions that have been gradually tested and exposed. History shows that major conflicts rarely begin with a single dramatic event. They develop through accumulated pressure, where repeated smaller incidents test limits and expose assumptions, until one moment pushes the system beyond its capacity to absorb further shocks. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, for example, was not in itself sufficient to trigger a continental war. It functioned as the final trigger within a long chain of alliance obligations, mobilization plans, and strategic assumptions that had built up over time. Each step appeared manageable on its own until the system as a whole lost its ability to contain the escalation. What remains essential is not a precise prediction of timing or method. Any claim of certainty in that regard is unreliable. The important part is the framework for understanding why the question itself carries weight. At this moment in history, the global security structure built for a different era is gradually eroding. It is being tested by an adversary whose calculations are shaped by constraint rather than confidence, operating in a technological environment where the boundary between peace and conflict has become intentionally less clear. The alliance that emerges from this period will either be strengthened through successful adaptation or weakened through exposed fragmentation. In either case, it will shape the balance of power in Europe for the next generation, just as the outcomes of 1914, 1945, and 1989 defined their respective eras. History does not repeat exactly, but it often follows recognizable patterns. Those patterns are visible, even when the specific outcomes remain uncertain. The only question now is how they will unfold from here.